The silk thread is cool before your hands have warmed, and it carries a faint, dry whisper as it slides from the little bobbins behind you. In the early light of the Basel workroom, the warper stands with its narrow beam waiting, polished by years of palms, dust, oil, and patient use. You can smell the soft mixture of wood, metal, sizing, old stone, and the clean animal brightness of silk. A scent so slight that you only notice it when the room is still. Nothing begins with hurry here, because the threads themselves would object to hurry, catching on a rough nail, crossing where they shouldn't, or tightening against one another before the work has properly begun. The floorboards give a quiet answer beneath your shoes as you step closer, and the first task is simply to look, to let the eye travel from creel to guide, from guide to comb, from comb to beam. Each thread has its place, and each place belongs to a future ribbon that no one in the room can yet see, except in the plainest way. The ribbon is not a ribbon yet, not something that might trim a hat, edge a bodice, fasten a parcel, or lie folded in a drawer among gloves and letters. It's only length, order, and tension, and for the warper, that's already a kind of promise. You stand beside a machine that history has not kept with much care, though it once held the beginning of a craft that made Basel known far beyond its hills and river. The ribbon loom has its admirers, the jacquard card has its neat romance, and the finished silk has its place in museum drawers, still shining faintly under careful light. But the warper and the person who tended it often slipped between names, partly machine, partly roll, partly preparatory labor, and partly just another necessary thing done before the visible work could start. It belonged to the quiet middle of making, where so many human hands have always lived. In the 1920s, when Basel's silk ribbon trade was already feeling the long tiredness of changing fashion, war losses, new materials, and cheaper production elsewhere, a ribbon warper could still be found in rooms where the older rhythm lingered. There might be electric power now in some workshops, a belt moving overhead, a motor humming with an even breath, and yet the work still depended on fingers that knew the temper of thread. A machine could turn the beam, but it could not feel the smallest roughness in a silk end, or notice that one bobbin was feeding a little too quickly. It could not remember, as you remember, that a mistake at the beginning becomes a nuisance for everyone who comes after. The room is neither grand nor poor in the theatrical sense, because most workrooms are not built for drama, only for use. There are high windows because silk needs light, and there are shades or curtains because too much sun can be its own trouble, fading colors and warming the air until the threads feel different under the hand. A narrow shelf carries chalk, small scissors, bits of string, a paste pot, folded paper, and a few labels saved from older jobs. Somewhere nearby, a kettle may already be warm, and a cup stands on a ledge where it won't be knocked by an elbow. Before any ribbon can be woven, its lengthwise threads have to be gathered and arranged, and that simple sentence contains nearly the whole life of the warper. The warp is the part that runs along the length of the cloth, held under tension while the weft crosses through it. And in ribbon work, those long threads must be counted, separated, and placed with particular care. A ribbon is narrow, but narrow things are not necessarily simple, because every edge shows, and every little unevenness has fewer places to hide. The warper prepares the order before the loom gives it pattern. You draw one thread forward, then another, and the touch is not like cotton, linen, or wool, because silk has a cooler slide and a smoother impatience. It wants to move, but it also wants to kink if neglected, and it can shine so beautifully that the eye may forgive what the loom will not forgive. Threads pass through small guides, over rods, through a reed or comb, and onward toward the beam, where they're wound in measured length. The beam turns slowly, gathering a future that must remain even, flat, and obedient. The Basel ribbon trade had grown from older migrations, older skills, and older agreements between town and countryside, until ribbons became one of the familiar products of the region. In the hills and villages around the city, looms had once stood in homes, in rooms where family life and factory rhythm met each other, without clear borders. A child might know the sound of a loom before knowing many words, and a meal might be eaten beside the same machine that paid for flour, rent, lamp oil, and Sunday cloth. The ordinary life of ribbon was never separate from the ordinary life of the household. By the time you reach the 1920s, that older world has not vanished all at once, though much of it has begun to loosen. Some machines are in factories, some remain in homes, and some jobs move between them in ways that make later records untidy. A warper might be listed as a textile worker, a ribbon worker, a silk worker, a factory hand, or not named at all if the work was considered part of a family arrangement. This is one way a job disappears, not by ceasing, but by being folded into larger words that lie flat on the page. The exact hands become harder to find. The warper's day begins with preparation rather than production, and preparation has always been easy for outsiders to overlook. Finished ribbon can be measured and sold, displayed and praised, tacked into sample books, or tied around goods whose buyers may never know where the shine began. The loom can be photographed because it has size and motion and a satisfying geometry of shafts, shuttles, harnesses, and cards. But the warper's work is quieter, and it happens before color becomes pattern, before pattern becomes fashion, and before fashion becomes memory. It's the part of making that makes other making possible. You check the bobbins one by one, not with a theatrical squint, but with the familiar softness of someone making sure the day won't snag too early. Each bobbin has been wound elsewhere, and each carries thread that must feed without jerking, because a tight pull can spoil the evenness of the whole spread. The bobbins sit in a creel, a frame like a many-eyed rack, and from this frame the fine lines travel forward together. When they are all moving at once, they make a sound almost too delicate to call a sound, a shiver of silk passing through order. There's a counting to this work, but it is not the brisk counting of a clerk, because the body counts too. The fingers know when a group is complete, the eye notices when a space looks wrong, and the ears hear a roughness in the run that may mean a thread has caught behind you. In some warping work, the threads are crossed in a lease so their order can be preserved later, a small and practical miracle that keeps hundreds of fine lines from becoming a shining confusion. The cross is not ornament, but memory made out of thread. When a thread breaks, the day does not collapse, and no one makes much of it because breakage is one of the small weather systems of textile work. You stop, find the end, moisten or twist it if needed, tie or piece it with care, and bring it back into company with the others. The knot must be small, the join must be honest, and the movement resumes with the softer attention for the next few turns. There is a kind of mercy in such repairs, because the work accepts small failures as long as they are noticed in time. The Basel Ribbon Warper was not only a machine, and not only a worker, and perhaps that is another reason we lost track of it. In old trade language, a word could point to the person who warped the apparatus used for warping, or the whole station where thread became a prepared warp. Later, when collectors tried to name surviving objects, and archivists sorted inventories, and museums chose which machines had the clearest stories, the word did not always sit still. It drifted, as working words often drift, between the tool, the task, and the person bending over both. The 1920s were not empty years for silk, but they were uneasy ones, with older luxury trades trying to understand what the new century wanted. Ribbons had once been everywhere in fashionable dress, on hats, coats, gowns, children's clothes, uniforms, parcels, and domestic things that liked a finished edge. Yet fashion changed its mind, as fashion does, and the long decorated surfaces of the 19th century gave way to simpler lines, shorter garments, cheaper trims, and new fibers that promised brightness without the same cost. A warper might not speak of such changes in large terms, but they reached the workroom all the same. Perhaps there are fewer orders this month, or the colors are plainer, or the master has said that a certain pattern won't be made again. Perhaps a sample book stays longer on the shelf, and the new designs from the city do not require as many hands as before. You still come in, still prepare the threads, still turn the beam, because work continues in small practical units long after a trade has begun to decline. Decline is not a falling curtain, but a thinning of sound, one loom silent in a village, then another, and then a room where the marks on the floor outlast the machine. On the warper, the beam receives the threads in smooth layers, and between layers there may be paper or rods, depending on the method and the delicacy of the yarn. The purpose is simple and exacting, because the warp must not bite into itself, and the pressure must stay even across the width. If one side winds tighter than the other, trouble is stored quietly for later, like a hidden wrinkle in folded cloth. You can see it as the beam grows, a slight fullness here, a slight hunger there, and you correct it with patience before the mistake becomes settled. The beam itself is not large in the way broadcloth beams are large, because ribbon work is narrow, but narrowness has its own concentration. A ribbon may be only a few fingers wide, yet it can contain many warp ends, fine edge structures, colored stripes, or planned spaces where the weft will later do its part. The warper's task is to hold that possibility without indulging in it, to prepare the ground without seeing the flowers. It's humble work in the old sense of humble, close to the ground, close to the beginning, and close to the hand. Outside, Basel moves according to its own morning, with carts, bicycles, shop shutters, church bells, and the Rhine carrying light between stone edges. The city has known merchants, dyers, printers, ribbon lords, chemists, bankers, and workers whose names lived mostly in ledgers. In narrow streets and in villages beyond, silk once connected many kinds of rooms, from counting houses with polished desks to kitchens where a loom took up half the space. The warper belongs to that network, though not always in the drawings that survive, because preparatory labor rarely stands at the center of the picture. You might have eaten bread before coming in, with butter if there was enough, and coffee made thin and warm enough to hold between both hands. Perhaps your lunch is wrapped in cloth nearby, placed where silk dust won't settle on it, though silk dust is never as heavy as cotton dust, and has its own faint way of floating. The room is cool at first, then slowly warms with bodies and machinery, and the windows gather a pale film of day. Work like this measures time not by clocks alone, but by the swelling of the beam and the emptying of the bobbins behind you. There is companionship in the room, even when no one speaks for long stretches, because repetitive work teaches people how to be together quietly. Someone clears a throat, someone shifts a stool, someone hums 2 notes and then lets them go, and the machine answers with its own even turning. A question may pass across the room in dialect, soft and practical, about thread, an order number, a missing pair of scissors, or whether the kettle has boiled. Then the work closes around everyone again, not coldly, but with the steady kindness of a routine that knows what comes next. To understand why the Basel Ribbon Warper slipped from memory, it helps to notice where attention tends to settle. We remember machines that seem to change history in a clean line, machines with names that sound modern, machines that announce themselves as inventions. We remember designers, owners, patents, exhibitions, crises, and sometimes strikes, because these leave stronger paper trails than ordinary hours. But the warper belongs to the long, soft middle, where no single morning looks remarkable enough to preserve, though all the mornings together made the woven thing possible. A loom without a warp is only waiting, and yet the waiting machine often gets more notice than the hands that ended its waiting. The prepared warp arrives like a disciplined river, wound and ordered, ready to be mounted and drawn in, ready to meet heddles, reeds, shuttles, and pattern. Anyone watching the loom later might admire the sudden emergence of ribbon, not realizing that the success began earlier, in another corner, with counting and tension. History, too, can be like a loom watcher, impressed by what moves most visibly and less aware of the stillness that made movement possible. The warper's work is also easy to lose because it's a threshold job, and thresholds are often walked through without being named. The silk has already been reeled, thrown, dyed, or wound depending on its journey, and the weaving has not yet begun, so the warper stands between finished preparation and visible production. In that in-between place, responsibility is high, but recognition is low, because success means that no one has to stop and think about you. When the warp runs cleanly on the loom, the warper's care disappears into everyone else's ease. The machinery itself may not survive with labels that satisfy us. A wooden warping frame can be dismantled and mistaken for plain workshop timber, while iron parts can be sold, reused, repaired beyond recognition, or pushed into a corner when a new machine arrives. Small machines used for narrow goods may look modest beside great looms, and modest things are more likely to be thrown away when space becomes dear. In the 1920s and after, as orders shrank and workshops closed, the warper might have left no grand ruin, only screw holes in the floor and a remembered path between creel and beam. Imagine, then, a room being cleared some years later, not with violence, but with the matter-of-fact sadness of work that has moved on. The bobbins are sorted, the better tools kept, the worn ones put aside, and the old warper is judged by whether it can earn, not by whether it can explain a vanished rhythm. Its beam may go to one place, its rods to another, its frame burned, stored, sold, or cut down for use in a shed. A machine that once held thousands of threads in order becomes, very quietly, parts. The records do not always rescue it, because records have their own habits of blindness. A factory inventory may list looms, motors, jacquard heads, and stock, while a warping device appears under a general phrase, or not at all if it's considered too ordinary to count separately. Wage books may name workers by broad categories, especially where women's or family labor is concerned, and a person who spent her day warping ribbon could be made invisible by a wider word. The more routine the work, the more likely the record assumes everyone knows what it means, until one day almost no one does. Still, inside the lostness, the work remains imaginable because the body of the job is so clear. You stand, you draw, you guide, you watch tension, you mend breaks, you keep order, and you wind the prepared length onto the beam. You do not need applause, and in truth, applause would feel strange in such a room, where the proper reward is a warp that behaves and a loom that starts without complaint. The satisfaction is quiet, but it is not small, because there is deep relief in making something ready. At mid-morning, the first light has risen high enough to touch the upper wall, and the room has become more awake without becoming louder. The thread paths shine at certain angles, disappearing when you move your head and returning when the light catches them again. If the silk is dyed, perhaps there is a red so deep it looks almost brown in shadow, or a blue that becomes livelier near the window, or a cream that seems to hold daylight inside itself. Colors at the warper are not yet pattern, but they already have moods. You may have learned the work from someone who rarely explained more than necessary, because skilled routines often pass through correction rather than speech. A hand reached over yours, moved one thread back into place, tightened a knot, slowed the turn, and let you feel the difference between too much pull and enough. At first, the machine may have seemed full of separate duties, but after months or years it became one continuous act, like tying a shoe or kneading dough. The body remembered what the mind no longer had to announce. There is comfort in that kind of learned motion, and there is also fatigue, though the fatigue is not the dramatic kind that asks to be described with heavy words. It settles in the shoulders, in the fingers, in the eyes that have been following pale lines against pale light. A warper may rub the thumb and forefinger together at the end of the day and still feel silk passing through them, as though the thread has left a phantom smoothness in the skin. Many quiet jobs continue after the shift has ended, not in labor, but in sensation. The Basel Ribbon Warper belonged to a trade whose products were meant to be noticed elsewhere, often far from the room of their making. A ribbon might travel folded in tissue sewn onto a dress wrapped around a hat, displayed behind glass, or carried across borders in a merchant's case. The person who warped it might never see the final buyer, and the buyer might never imagine the creel, the guide rods, the beam, or the morning breath of the worker beside the machine. Luxury often floats away from labor, leaving labor behind in the quiet places where it began. This distance helps explain the forgetting, but it does not make the work less real. In fact, there is something deeply human about jobs that vanish into the smoothness of a finished object, because so much of ordinary life depends on preparation no one praises. Someone sharpens the knife before the meal, oils the hinge before the door swings, sweeps the floor before guests arrive, and winds the warp before the ribbon takes form. The world is held together by acts that become invisible when done well. By noon, the room smells warmer, and the threads run with a softer willingness as the day settles into its middle stretch. Outside, the city may be bright, but in the workroom the light is moderated, turned useful rather than pretty, so the eye can remain steady. A foreman or senior worker checks the progress, not with ceremony, but with the practical look of someone measuring whether the beam is filling evenly. If there is a small correction to make, it's made, and if the run is clean, the machine is allowed to keep its pace. The pace is not the same as speed, and the difference matters. Speed wants more, while pace wants steadiness, and the warper's success depends more on steadiness than on haste. Too fast, and the thread may heat, catch, twist, or hide a flaw. Too slow, and the day lengthens without need, leaving other workers waiting. The proper pace is learned through listening, through the tiny sounds of guides and bobbins, through the sight of the beam's surface forming with an evenness that calms the eye. In the older Basel system, ribbon weaving had often belonged to a world of homework and merchant control, with agents in the city and workers in surrounding communities tied together by orders, materials, and payments. By the 20th century, factory production had changed much of that arrangement, but traces of the older system remained in memory and habit. The warper, whether in a factory or a smaller workshop, carried forward a relationship to thread that was older than the machine beside them. Modernity did not arrive as a clean replacement, but as one more layer laid over older hands. That layering is another reason the warper becomes hard to follow. Was the 1920s Basel Ribbon Warper an old wooden apparatus, still useful in a small shop, or a powered machine in a larger factory, or the worker assigned to prepare ribbon warps for changing designs? The honest answer may be all of these, depending on the room, the year, the order, and the person speaking. Historical memory likes neat objects, but working life often gives us overlapping names, improvised repairs, borrowed methods, and machines that have been altered so often they no longer match the catalogue. A catalogue image, if one survives, may show a clean machine with no loose thread, no cold fingers, no lunch cloth, no dust gathered under the frame, and no worker leaning in to listen. It may have a name, a maker, a model, and perhaps a proud phrase about efficiency, because sales language has always liked confidence. But the real warper in use has smoothed edges, oil-darkened bearings, hatched belts, pencil marks, and small accommodations made by those who knew its moods. Between catalogue and workroom lies the whole life of a machine. You turn the beam another measured length, and the silk lays itself down with a modest shine. There is no applause for a good layer, only the absence of trouble, and perhaps a small easing in the chest, as you see that the surface is true. A thread near the edge begins to wander, and you guide it back before it teaches the others a bad habit. The correction is so small that no later historian could find it, yet the ribbon may owe its clean edge to that moment. At times, the work may feel almost like tending water, because a warp has flow even though each thread is dry. It divides and gathers, narrows and widens, slips through fingers, and takes the shape of whatever channel has been prepared for it. The warper's job is not to force the flow, but to persuade it into order, using guides, crosses, tension, and an eye for the smallest deviations. You learn that gentleness is not weakness here, it's technique, because silk responds better to patience than to command. The term ribbon warper does not carry the instant recognition of blacksmith, miller, printer, or weaver, and this too lets it fade. Many people understand weaving in broad strokes, but fewer think about the preparation of warp, especially for narrow goods, where the equipment may be specialized and the finished product deceptively simple. The ribbon, once complete, seems almost inevitable, as if it were born narrow, edged, glossy, and ready to fold. But before inevitability, there was sorting, threading, counting, tying, winding, and watching hour after hour. And so we lost track of the Basel Ribbon Warper, not because it was unneeded, but because it was too needed in the ordinary way. It belonged to the daily rhythm, and daily rhythms often become background, especially when the trade around them declines, and the surviving beauty is saved in drawers rather than in motion. Museums can preserve the ribbon and sometimes the loom, but the preparatory station is harder to display because its meaning lies in use. A still warper is only a puzzle of rods and beams until you imagine the thread moving through it. The afternoon comes softly, with no single turning point, only a gradual change in the light and a slight heaviness in the room. The beam has grown fuller, the creel has grown emptier, and the work has become both more satisfying and more delicate. because a nearly completed warp carries the weight of all the care already spent. You do not want to spoil it near the end, and so your attention becomes a little gentler, not sharper. The day has taught your hands its length, and your hands answer by slowing just enough. Somewhere, a door opens and closes, bringing in the smell of outside stone, damp wool, and perhaps smoke from a chimney. The sounds of the street enter briefly, then thin out behind the steady whisper of thread, as if the workroom has its own weather. A co-worker asks whether this beam is for a narrow black ribbon or a figured silk order, and someone answers without lifting their eyes. In such exchanges, whole economies become small enough to fit inside a sentence. The ribbon warper's knowledge was practical knowledge, which means it lived in doing and was often lost when doing stopped. A written instruction might tell someone to keep even tension, but it could not fully explain what even tension felt like when silk moved through the fingers. It might describe how to preserve the lease, but not the small dread of discovering two ends crossed after a long wind. It might name the parts of the machine, but not the exact sound of one bearing beginning to complain. When trades decline, this kind of knowledge leaves quietly. Older workers retire, younger ones take jobs in offices, chemical plants, shops, transport, or newer textile lines, and machines that once required apprentices become curiosities too plain to attract much notice. A craft can persist in a few places for decades after its main world has altered, but its supporting vocabulary thins with every year. At last, the word remains, but the room around it is gone, and we have to rebuild the room gently from clues. The clues are modest, and modest clues suit this story. Basel had ribbon weaving, narrow silk goods, home and factory labor, changing fashions, early electrification in surrounding communities, and a decline that became especially visible in the 20th century. Warping was necessary for ribbon weaving, and a warper, human or mechanical, prepared the lengthwise threads that gave the ribbon its body and its future edge. From these plain facts, a whole morning can be imagined without forcing it, because the logic of work is patient and durable. You may not know while standing there that anyone will later ask why you were forgotten. It would be a strange question to bring into the room where the day's order matters more than history's affection. You might laugh softly at the idea that a person far away in time would wonder about the machine, because to you, it's simply the warper, with its familiar stiffness in cold weather and its smoother run after oiling. Not everything meaningful announces itself while it is happening. And perhaps that is the most restful truth inside the old work. So many lives are made from useful motions that do not ask to be remembered by name, though they deserve to be understood with care. The Basel Ribbon Warper stands among them, not as a mystery to be solved sharply, but as a forgotten corner to be lit slowly so the dust can be seen without being disturbed. It asks us to look at the beginning of a ribbon and stay there for a while before beauty becomes portable. The beam turns again, and you can feel the faint resistance of the gathered silk becoming heavier as it winds. There is a small pleasure in weight gained through order, the way a basket fills with folded linen or a drawer accepts tools cleaned and laid straight. Nothing has changed quickly, and yet something has been made ready, thread by thread, layer by layer, with a kind of progress that refuses to hurry. The machine's quiet turning becomes almost like breathing, and your own breathing gradually follows it. The day's work is not finished yet, but it has entered the long, even portion where thought can wander without abandoning the task. You think of the ribbon that will come later, perhaps black for mourning trim, perhaps pale for a child's dress, perhaps striped for a hatband, perhaps ornamental in a way that will soon feel old-fashioned. Each possibility begins in the same humble discipline of aligned threads, and each depends on the warper's refusal to let small disorder pass unnoticed. There is peace in such refusal because it is not severe. It is simply care. A small scrap of paper near the machine carries the order details, and the writing has begun to soften at the edges from handling. It may note color, width, length, customer, loom assignment, or some abbreviation that everyone in the shop understands and no one in the future will understand at once. These little slips are the kind of evidence that vanishes first, swept away when the order is done or tucked into a ledger whose meaning fades with the trade. The future saves what it can, but workshops were never arranged for future curiosity. You guide the last span of the present section, keeping your eyes where the threads enter the comb, because that is where trouble often first shows itself. One end trembles differently from the others, and you pause, find the reason, and ease it free from a tiny catch on the bobbin rim. The correction takes less than a minute, but it preserves the long smoothness already wound, and the beam accepts the thread again as though nothing happened. Good work often looks from the outside like nothing happened. That may be the warper's whole secret, and perhaps the reason the roll became almost invisible. When the work is done well, the result is not a dramatic object, but the prevention of later difficulty. And prevention rarely leaves monuments. No torn warp, no uneven edge, no repeated stoppage at the loom, no wasted silk, no impatient foreman, no late delivery caused by a mistake laid down at the start. The reward is a chain of absences, and history is better at seeing presence than absence. Yet in the quiet of the room, those absences feel substantial. You know what has been avoided because your hands know how easily it could have gone otherwise, and that knowledge is enough for the moment. The machine does not need to be famous to be companionable, and the task does not need to be celebrated to carry dignity. A prepared warp rests on the beam like a sleeping thing, full of future movement, and for now it is safe. The finished beam is not lifted at once, because even the end of a task has its small ceremonies, and haste can trouble what patience has just made. You secure the loose ends in their proper order, tying them gently enough that they can be opened later without confusion, and you mark the warp so the next hands know what has been prepared. The label may be no more than a strip of card, a penciled note, and a bit of string, but in the workroom it carries the memory of the morning. There is a particular quiet after a beam is completed, a quiet made not from silence alone, but from the release of attention that has been held for hours. The bobbins behind you look suddenly bare, and the creel seems lighter, as though it too has been emptied of thought. A small pile of waste thread rests near the foot of the machine, bright and tangled, too poor for the ribbon yet too pretty to throw away without looking at it. Someone will sweep it later, and for a moment it shines like a nest made of colour. The beam must go onward now, perhaps to a loom in the same room, perhaps to another floor, perhaps to a weaver who will recognize the warper's care without saying much about it. In many trades, respect travels through such brief acknowledgements, through a nod, a hand on the beam, or the absence of complaint when the work begins. A weaver who receives a clean warp can feel it almost immediately, in the smooth draw, the even edge, and the lack of those small stoppages that gather irritation around the day. Praise, when it comes, may be nothing more than a calm continuation. You brush lint from the guide rods, clear the threads caught near the frame, and run your hand over the wood where the varnish has worn thin. The machine has places where touch has made a softer shine, especially near the handles and edges that workers have used without thinking for years. Such polish is not decorative, but it is beautiful in the way old stair rails are beautiful, carrying evidence of many hands that needed the same support. The surface remembers what the ledgers forget. A Basel Ribbon Warper in those years stood at the edge of several changing worlds, though the machine itself might seem unconcerned with all of them. Outside the workroom, new factories, new wages, new unions, new customs, and new fashions were rearranging the old agreements between skill and livelihood. Inside, the thread still had to move in order, and every order still began with some practical arrangement of length, color, number, and tension. The world could change greatly, and still the thread would catch on a rough place if no one was watching. This is often how history feels from inside a job, not like a grand turning of an age, but like a change in materials. A different order sheet, fewer familiar faces, or a new machine placed where an old bench stood. You might hear that a factory across the river has reduced hours, or that a merchant has found cheaper goods elsewhere, or that a neighbor's daughter has gone into office work and will no longer learn the loom. The news is folded into the day's routines, spoken between tasks, absorbed, and then set aside because the warp is still waiting. The silk itself carries a long story before it reaches your hand, longer than the workroom can hold in its walls. It may have passed through merchants, dyers, throsters, winders, and warehousemen, each person leaving the thread a little more ready for the next. By the time it comes to the ribbon warper, It has already been made obedient in certain ways, strengthened, colored, sized, wound, and sorted according to the needs of a pattern or plain ribbon. Yet it remains delicate enough to punish neglect, as if reminding every worker that preparation is never finished until the final cloth is made. You may know some of this story, or only the parts that touch your own station, because workers often understand the wider trade through the neighboring tasks they meet each day. The dyer's work arrives as color, the winder's work arrives as bobbins, the designer's work arrives as instruction, and the weaver's work waits just ahead. You stand among these arrivals and departures, not at the top or bottom of the chain, but at a necessary bend in its path. The machine makes that bend visible, drawing many separate ends into one disciplined course. When the next order is prepared, the room changes slightly, though its rhythm remains familiar. Different thread behaves with different manners, and a darker color may be easier on the eye, while a pale thread may reveal every shadow and stray fiber. Some silk runs smoothly from the bobbin as though pleased to leave it, while other silk seems to remember every winding and complains in tiny pulls. The warper learns these personalities without becoming fanciful, because practical people often know materials as intimately as poets do, though they use fewer ornamental words. A red ribbon order may leave faint color on the fingertips, not much, only enough to notice when washing later. A black order can darken the mood of the machine in the simplest visual way, making the guides and rods appear sharper against the thread. Cream or ivory silk can seem almost weightless under morning light, and if the workroom window is open a little, it may tremble at a draft you cannot feel on your cheek. The tiniest movement matters when many threads are asked to behave as one. Before the new warp begins, the creel must be filled again, and this task has its own slow patience. Bobbins are placed according to the order needed, not merely wherever the hand finds room, because the path from creel to guide must remain clean. Crossed paths waste attention later, and a thread pulled from the wrong angle may chafe, tighten, or break at the least convenient moment. Good arrangement at the back of the machine is a kindness extended to the front, a small act of foresight disguised as tidiness. You lift each bobbin into place, feeling its weight, checking whether the winding sits firm and even. Some are full and round, some already partly used, and a practiced worker can tell by hand whether a bobbin will last through a section or need watching. There is no romance in running out too soon, only a pause, a join, and a risk of unevenness if the change is clumsily made. So the beginning is checked again, because every thread has a future far longer than the distance you can see. In a larger workshop, there might be several such stations, each one feeding the ribbon trade in its modest way. Some workers might be young, still learning the difference between neatness that pleases the eye and neatness that protects the work. Others might be older, with a steady economy of movement that makes every correction look smaller than it is. The room teaches without announcing itself, through repetition, comparison, and the soft embarrassment of making a mistake that everyone else has made before. One of the overlooked details of textile work is the way it trains listening. The ear learns the healthy hum of movement, the dry scratch of a thread rubbing, the uneven clicking of a bobbin, and the faint change in pitch when tension alters. A stranger might hear only a general mechanical murmur, but you hear a room of separate messages, each one quiet and specific. In such a place, noise is not the opposite of silence, because some noises are forms of guidance. The ribbon warper's machine is not loud like a great engine or a stamping press, and even in a powered shop, it occupies a softer band of sound. There may be a belt overhead, a pulley with a gentle slap, a turning shaft, and perhaps the deeper breath of other machinery nearby. But the warper itself keeps a finer rhythm, dominated by thread, wood, and the small turning parts that support the winding. Its sound belongs closer to spinning wheels, sewing rooms, and paper handling than to the heavy iron music of industry. That is another reason it can vanish from memory, because our imagination of industry often grows too heavy. We picture smoke, furnaces, hammers, and great machines shaking brick walls, and such images have their truth in many places. Yet industry also included narrow rooms, sorted colors, prepared bobbins, and people whose chief task was to prevent fine thread from tangling. The industrial world was not only force, it was also attention. repeated until it became nearly invisible. Basel itself held both kinds of industry, the heavier and the finer, especially as chemicals, dyes, and textile trades shaped the city's modern life. The same region that cared about silk color and printed patterns also developed technical knowledge that would move in many directions. But on the warper's floor, these large movements arrive as practical facts, such as a new dye shade, a changed supply, a different sizing, or a thread that behaves unlike the one used last year. History touches the hand through material first. The task of drawing threads through the guides can become almost meditative, though it should not be mistaken for idleness. Each motion is small, but it must be placed correctly, and the mind rests not by leaving the work, but by entering its rhythm. You take an end, pass it through, set it with its companions, and return for the next, while the body folds the motion into breath. It is possible to think of home, weather, money, or nothing at all, because the work holds part of the mind and leaves another part floating softly nearby. There may be a stool near the machine, though not every part of the day allows sitting. Some tasks bring you close to the creel, some to the comb, some to the beam, and the body learns when to bend, stand, lean, or step back. The work is not athletic, but it accumulates, especially in the back, neck, and eyes. And by evening, the smallest muscles of the fingers can feel as if they've been whispering all day. Fatigue in such work is fine-grained, like the thread itself. A small tin of oil stands where it can be reached, because a machine that turns daily must be given its own little meal. The smell of oil is part of the workshop's weather, not heavy enough to overpower the silk, but always present near bearings and moving parts. You oil sparingly, wipe what does not belong, and turn the handle or start the motion again to hear whether the sound has softened. The machine answers in the only language it has, and the worker listens for ease. Repairs, too, happen in this practical register. A guide may need smoothing, a wooden edge may be rubbed down, a screw tightened, a belt adjusted, or a worn cord replaced before it breaks at the wrong time. Much of this maintenance may never pass through an official repair book, because workers have always mended small things as part of keeping the day alive. When later people ask what happened to the machine, they may forget that it was never a single fixed object, but an accumulation of use, repair, replacement, and local habit. The warper in 1920s Basel may have carried older parts, newer attachments, and little workshop improvements made by someone whose name no catalogue preserved. Perhaps a guide was moved half an inch because a certain silk frayed there, or a shelf was added for order slips, or a handle was wrapped because winter made the metal unpleasantly cold. These changes are not inventions in the public sense, but they are acts of intelligence. They show how workers quietly shape the tools that shape their days. As afternoon deepens, the workroom's shadows begin to lengthen, and the bright lines of thread become softer against the duller light. If lamps are used, they change the silk again, giving it a warmer sheen and turning pale colors more honeyed. The eye must adjust, and perhaps the best tasks are saved for daylight when possible, because a bad light can make careful work more tiring than it needs to be. Even in industry, the sun remains part of the equipment. There is a window ledge where dust gathers in the corners, and if you look closely, some of that dust is not dust at all, but thread fiber and fine silk fluff caught in the still air. It settles on paper, on the edges of tools, and in the small places where sweeping cannot easily reach. A worker might clean it without thinking, not because the room must look perfect, but because loose fiber has a talent for moving where it isn't wanted. Cleanliness in such a room is not decoration, it is prevention again. The prepared warp for ribbon is narrow enough that an outsider may underestimate it. Yet its narrowness makes the edge especially unforgiving. In broadcloth, a small irregularity may be lost in width, finishing, or cutting, but in ribbon the edge often remains the edge, seen and handled as it was woven. A good ribbon has a confident boundary, a line that feels settled rather than strained, and that boundary begins with the warp being evenly placed. The warper helps give the ribbon its composure before the weft ever crosses. Ribbon edges may later be woven with particular structures, sometimes stronger, sometimes decorative, sometimes simply neat enough to resist fraying. But even those later choices need a well-prepared beginning because pattern cannot save disorder that has been wound into the foundation. This is true beyond textiles, in ways the worker may never have described aloud. A careful beginning does not guarantee beauty, but it gives beauty a place to stand. The word Basel might bring to mind the Rhine, old guild streets, university rooms, and the meeting of boarders. But there is also this quieter Basel of workshop floors and textile orders. It is a city made not only by public buildings and famous names, but by repeated labor in rooms that were practical before they were picturesque. The ribbon trade filled some of those rooms with color, but not always with wealth for those who handled the thread. Still, the work carried skill, and skill has its own dignity even when pay and recognition are uneven. You can imagine the worker leaving at day's end, carrying home the smell of oil and silk in clothing, perhaps too faint for anyone else to name. The hands may be washed, the hair smoothed, the coat buttoned, and the street entered with the slight blinking feeling that comes after hours of close visual work. Outside, the city is larger than the machine, yet for the worker the machine remains in the body's memory, its height, reach, sound, and pressure still present for a while. Workplaces follow people home in such quiet ways. At home, the evening may hold ordinary things: a meal, mending, washing, children's noise, a newspaper, a tired conversation, or simply the relief of sitting without needing to watch anything so closely. If the worker lives in a household tied to the ribbon trade, the talk may return to orders, wages, hours, and who has heard of another shop hiring. If not, the warper may remain only the day's labor, set aside until morning calls it back. Many people have lived skillful lives without turning their skill into stories at the table. This is part of the loss too, because families remember feelings, habits, and necessities more easily than technical names. A granddaughter may recall that her grandmother worked with silk, or in ribbons, or in a factory near a certain street, but not that she warped ribbon for narrow looms. A surviving photograph may show a woman in a dark dress beside a machine, and the machine's exact purpose may be guessed at by those who come later. Memory keeps the person and lets the tool blur. The blurring can be tender, not only sad, because most working lives were never meant to become museum labels. They were meant to earn, to sustain, to pass through the week, to provide bread, rent, coal, cloth, and perhaps a little room for pride. The warper's job was not obscure to those who depended on it, and that may have been enough while the trade remained alive. Obscurity often comes afterward, when a once ordinary thing no longer has enough living witnesses to explain it casually. In the morning, though, the witness is still here, because you are standing again at the creel with threads waiting. The world has not yet forgotten anything, and the machine has not become a question. It is simply there, with its guides aligned, its beam ready, its little irregularities known, and its place in the day secure. You do not need to name its historical significance, because you need only begin. The first threads of a new warp pass forward, and each one seems almost weightless until gathered with the others. Together they acquire presence, like a mist becoming rain, or like many small errands becoming a life. You guide them through the appointed places, and the machine gradually fills with lines, not tangled lines, but parallel intentions. The work has begun again with the same plain grace it had yesterday. A person watching from the doorway might see repetition and miss the variation. The same motions return, yes, but never in exactly the same way, because each thread lot, each weather change, each worker's mood, and each machine condition alters the day slightly. Humidity can soften or trouble the thread, cold can stiffen fingers, and a rushed order can change the atmosphere of the room, even if no one speaks sharply. Routine is not sameness. It is a practiced way of meeting small differences. The weather matters more than outsiders might think. Damp air may make certain fibers more manageable, while dry air can invite static, flyaway ends, and brittle behavior in fine thread. A stormy day may dim the windows and make the lamps necessary earlier, while a clear winter morning may bring beautiful light and cold hands. The worker does not need a scientific lecture to know these things, because the thread reports the weather directly to the fingers. In this sense, the ribbon warper belongs to a very old family of trades, those that stand between material and atmosphere. Bakers feel flour change with weather, printers feel paper swell or resist, Carpenters hear wood answer differently, and textile workers know fibers as living conditions almost as much as substances. The warper learns to accommodate, to slow a little, tighten slightly, loosen carefully, or watch a particular section more closely because the day has asked for it. The work is technical, but it is also domestic in its attention to small climate. A little draft from a badly closed door may disturb a loose end, and someone crosses the room to shut it without complaint. A guide with a rough spot may be rubbed smooth, perhaps with fine abrasive or a scrap suited to the purpose, because a tiny burr can become a repeated break. The beam is checked, the order slip consulted, the count confirmed, and the turning resumes. In this steady sequence, the worker protects the future ribbon from the hidden accidents of the present. The warper's count is one of those quiet acts that can seem simple only when correct. Too few ends, and the ribbon may lack fullness, width, or proper structure. Too many, and the loom may resist, the pattern may alter, or the edge may misbehave. In some work, colors must appear in exact order, a group of dark ends, a group of light, perhaps a narrow stripe or a border that will later seem effortless. The counting is not merely arithmetic. It is the architecture of softness. Because all numbers in the shop are tied to matter, they feel different from numbers on a classroom slate. A dozen ends are not an abstraction, but a pinch of silk. A length is not a figure, but a beam slowly filling. A width is not just a measurement, but the distance between two edges that must agree. The worker thinks in quantities that can be touched, wound, lost, repaired, and carried. It is a gentle form of mathematics, held in the hands. When we say that the Basel Ribbon Warper was lost, we do not mean that every machine vanished in a single year, or that no one remembered the work at all. We mean something slower and more common, the gradual sinking of a roll beneath broader histories of silk, fashion, factories, and trade. The warper remained necessary until it wasn't. And when it ceased to be common, it lacked the dramatic outline that would keep it easily visible. It had done its work too well, and so it faded into the woven surface of other stories. There may still be surviving machines in collections, private storerooms, old factories, or regional museums, though they may not always carry the exact name a worker would have used. Some may be catalogued under warping, winding, preparation, narrow weaving equipment, or textile machinery, and some may wait for a specialist eye to understand them fully. Their wooden frames and metal guides may look plain to a visitor seeking spectacle. Yet, if you imagine the thread strung again, the whole object becomes awake. The sleeping machine is one of the gentlest images in industrial history. It does not smoke, roar, or threaten. It waits in its own geometry, holding the memory of thread paths like a field holds the memory of footpaths. If someone were to dress it again with silk, gently and correctly, the old purpose would become clear not through explanation, but through movement. The lost thing would not be entirely restored, because the workers and their world would still be gone, but the machine would speak a little, and perhaps that is enough for a quiet night's understanding, not a full recovery, but a respectful nearness. We cannot return to the 1920s workroom as it was, with every face, tool, order, and afternoon exactly placed. But we can slow down beside the warper and allow the ordinary sequence to gather again in the mind. Creel, guide, comb, beam, thread, tension, correction, label, and then another order waiting. Your hands move through that sequence now, and the room accepts the movement as it has accepted so many before. The bobbins feed their lines, the guides hold them apart, the comb gathers them into discipline, and the beam receives them in even layers. The work is not grand, but it is complete in its own way, and completeness is one of the calmest forms of beauty. It does not ask to shine, it only asks to hold. By late afternoon, the second warp is well underway, and the light at the window has turned the color of pale tea. Voices in the room grow softer, not because anyone has ordered quiet, but because the day's energy naturally lowers as the workers settle into its final stretch. The machine keeps turning, and the rhythm begins to feel older than the people present, as though it belongs to every workshop where patient preparation has ever been done. The thought comes and goes like dust in light. A worker nearby removes a finished bobbin and sets it aside, and the small wooden sound it makes on the shelf is familiar enough to be comforting. Another worker untangles a group of ends with a pin, lifting and easing them apart, rather than pulling, because force would only tighten the confusion. Someone laughs quietly at a comment you do not fully hear, and the laugh fades without disturbing the work. The room has many lives inside one rhythm. The warper's station may be near a wall or near a window, or tucked where the flow of materials makes sense, because industrial rooms are arranged around movement as much as furniture. Thread comes in, prepared beams go out, tools stay close, waste is gathered, and the worker's path becomes gradually worn into the floor. These paths matter, though they're rarely drawn on plans, because they show how labor truly inhabits space. A factory diagram may show machines, but the feet write the truth of the room. If the floor is wooden, it may have darkened under the machine from oil, shoes, and years of sweeping. If stone or concrete, it may hold a chill longer into the morning and return fatigue differently through the soles. In winter, the cold rises quietly, making the first hour more difficult for fingers that need nimbleness, while in summer, the air may feel close and the silk may cling differently. Every season enters the workroom, even when windows and walls pretend otherwise. The worker dresses for the job in practical layers, perhaps with sleeves managed so they do not catch, hair kept back, and no loose ornament near the moving thread. Clothing in such places is chosen by habit, modesty, economy, and safety, though no one may use that last word with modern formality. A sleeve cuff that catches is remembered once and corrected forever. The body learns the machine's boundaries, and those boundaries become second nature. There is a small humility in working with thread, because thread is both weak and strong depending on how it is treated. A single end can break with a careless pull, yet many ends together can make a ribbon strong enough to bind, decorate, edge, or endure years in a drawer. The warper handles weakness in order to prepare strength, and the lesson sits quietly in the hands. Many ordinary jobs have this shape, caring for what is fragile until it can serve. As the beam fills, its color deepens, not because the silk itself changes, but because layer upon layer gathers light differently. What seemed like thin lines becomes a smooth banded surface, and the eye can rest on it with the satisfaction of a field evenly raked. The worker may not use poetic language for this, yet the pleasure is real, a pleasure in order visible at last. It is the kind of pleasure that arrives without announcement. The end of the workday approaches in the practical manner of workdays, through tasks completed, tools returned, machines slowed, and people glancing once or twice at the clock. The warper cannot simply be abandoned mid-thought, because loose ends need securing, and the stage of work must be left intelligible for the next morning. A careless ending makes a poor beginning, and workers who understand routine understand this better than anyone. So the final minutes are not empty minutes. They are the hinge between today and tomorrow. You tie off what must be tied, cover what must be protected, and leave the thread paths in a state that will make sense when the light returns. The order slip is placed where it won't be lost. The scissors are set down in their known place, and the small waste is gathered with a brush. Around you, others perform their own closing gestures, each one plain, practiced, and nearly silent. The room becomes less a place of production and more a place of resting tools. The machine cools quickly once the motion stops, though the wood keeps a little warmth from the room. Without moving thread, the warper seems smaller, almost shy, as if its importance depended on the fine lines that animated it. The bobbins sit still in the creel, their surfaces duller now, and the beam waits with the day's length wound around it. A machine at rest always asks the imagination to remember motion. Outside, evening has softened Basel's edges, and the river, if you pass near it, carries the last light without needing to be admired. Workers leave through doors that have opened and closed for years, stepping into streets where the smells change from oil and silk to stone, food, smoke, and damp air. The workroom remains behind with its frames, beams, rods, and shelves, all of them ordinary enough to be left unphotographed. Yet inside that ordinariness, a lost trade keeps breathing faintly. And in the morning, before anyone calls it history, the door will open again, and the room will receive another day of careful hands. The first person in may pause near the threshold, letting the eyes adjust to the grey morning and the familiar outlines of frames. A room before work begins has a different kind of order from a room after work ends, because the tools are waiting forward rather than resting backward. The warper stands where it stood yesterday, with the half-prepared orders still secured and the tied ends lying quietly in their appointed place. You can feel, before touching anything, that the day will ask for the same care in a slightly different form. The stove or radiator may not yet have warmed the air, and the metal parts keep the night's chill a little longer than the wood. When you place your fingers near the guide rods, there is that first small shock of cold. Not enough to complain of, but enough to wake the skin. The silk, too, feels cooler in the morning, almost glassy until the room softens and the hands become ready. Work begins with this modest negotiation between body, material, and weather, as it has begun on so many mornings. You untie the secured ends, not quickly, because a knot made for order must be opened in order as well. The thread groups fall back into their paths, and you check them by eye, seeing whether any end has crossed while resting, whether any bobbin has slackened overnight, whether dust has settled where it might interfere. A small lamp may be lit even after dawn, just to give steadier light near the comb. It is not ceremony, but it feels like the room becoming present again. The beam is turned by hand for a moment before the regular motion resumes, and that first turn tells you whether the work has slept well. If the threads move cleanly, the body relaxes almost before the mind has formed the thought, and the old rhythm returns with little resistance. If one thread hesitates, it is found and eased back, because beginnings deserve patience even when the day is familiar. In textile work, a calm start can save many interruptions later, and every experienced worker knows the value of a quiet beginning. The ribbon warper's station is full of such practical wisdom, the kind that rarely becomes a formal rule because it lives better in repeated attention. You learn how much thread can hang loose without inviting a snarl, how far a bobbin may be trusted, and when a slightly rough sound means trouble rather than ordinary movement. You learn the difference between a knot that will pass and a knot that must be remade, between a harmless twist and a twist that will travel forward like a rumour. The work teaches through small consequences, and the worker answers by becoming steady. In the 1920s, a Basel worker might have known that the trade was thinner than it had been, even if the old stories still held their place. There were memories of busier decades, of houses with looms sounding through village rooms, of merchants who ordered ribbons by the careful sample and sent them far away. The warper did not need to know every market report to feel change arriving in the number of orders, the kind of ribbon requested, and the moods of those who managed the shop. Large economic changes often enter ordinary lives first as altered routines. Still, the room's daily tasks continue with their own authority. A warp must be prepared whether fashion is confident or uncertain, and the silk must be guided with the same precision whether the order is profitable or barely worthwhile. The machine does not understand decline, and perhaps that is part of why the work can remain restful to imagine. It asks not for prophecy, but for attention to what lies immediately before the hands. A new group of ends is drawn forward, and the fine lines separate over your fingers in a way that feels almost like combing hair. The threads resist slightly where they have kept the memory of their bobbins, then lengthened into straighter paths as they pass through the guides. At a certain angle, they seem to vanish completely, and the work must be followed by touch and habit as much as by sight. The thinness of silk can make the room feel larger because so much purpose is carried by something barely visible. You may keep a small cloth nearby to wipe the fingers, especially if oil, dust, or moisture threatens the cleanliness of the thread. Silk remembers what touches it, and a careless smudge can travel onward, not always as a stain, but as a change in handling or finish. The warper's hands must therefore be working hands and careful hands at once, practical enough for machinery, gentle enough for bright material. There is dignity in that combination, though it seldom makes itself grand. The prepared ribbon warp is one of those beginnings that has already passed through many beginnings. The silkworm's cocoon, the reeler's basin, the throster's twist, the dyer's vat, the winder's bobbin, and now the warper's beam all belong to a chain of transformation. By the time the loom receives the warp, the thread has been handled by many people who may never meet, and each must trust the previous hands without being able to thank them. Industry is often described through ownership and invention, but it also consists of this long practical trust. A worker in the warping room may not think of the chain as poetic, because chains of work are also chains of wages, deadlines, mistakes, and obligations. Yet there is a quiet fellowship hidden inside the dependence, because one careless stage burdens the next, and one careful stage eases it. The winder gives the warper a bobbin that feeds cleanly. The warper gives the weaver a beam that draws cleanly. The weaver gives the finisher a ribbon worth handling. Each task disappears a little into the next, like evening disappearing into night. The warper's machine, when viewed without thread, may seem almost too simple to deserve attention. A frame, a creel, rods, guides, a measuring arrangement, a beam, and perhaps a drive mechanism do not immediately announce the subtlety of their use. But simplicity in a tool can hide complexity in the hand, because the machine provides the path, while the worker provides the judgment. A tool does not need many parts to require deep familiarity. There may be marks on the frame that show where common widths were set, or where previous workers made small notches for alignment. Some marks are official, made carefully with measurement in mind, and others are merely practical scratches that became reliable over time. A visiting inspector might not notice them, but a worker sees them as part of the machine's language. Such marks are workshop memory, written not in ink but in use. You set the next section according to the needed width, and the adjustment is made with slow certainty rather than display. The guide positions must agree with the order, and the beam must receive the threads in a spread that will later match the loom's demands. A narrow ribbon may seem easy because its width is small, yet its margin for error is small as well, and the preparation must fit that narrow confidence. The more modest the object, the less room there may be for carelessness. On some days, the warper may prepare plain warp for simple ribbon, and on other days the arrangement may be more particular, with colored ends placed in planned sequence. A stripe that later looks effortless may begin as a careful ordering of bobbins at the creel and threads through the guides. The eye must hold the sequence, and the hand must not drift into convenient but wrong repetition. The ribbon's later pattern begins as discipline long before it becomes decoration. In a sample book, the finished ribbons will lie flat and obedient, fastened in rows with small labels, perhaps still bright after many decades. A viewer may admire their sheen, width, color, and pattern, but the sample book is a quiet liar if it makes the ribbon seem to have always been still. Each strip once moved through many hands and over many surfaces, pulled from storage, prepared, woven, finished, folded, cut, and fixed in place for showing. The warper's share of that motion is invisible in the book, yet the book could not exist without it. Collectors often save what can be easily admired, and this is understandable, because finished goods carry beauty plainly. Machinery asks for a different kind of patience, especially preparatory machinery whose purpose may not be obvious without demonstration. A ribbon loom can charm the eye with patterned motion, but a warper asks the viewer to imagine tension, order, and future usefulness. It asks for the kind of attention that resembles the work itself. The morning deepens, and the workroom settles into the level sound of things being done. A clock somewhere measures time, but the warper measures it differently. By sections completed, bobbins changed, ends mended, and the slow thickening of the beam. The worker's mind may drift to the next meal, the price of coal, a letter expected, a child's cough, or the ordinary uncertainty of wages. The hands remain with the thread, because the hands have learned where they belong. It is possible to become very close to a machine without loving it, in any sentimental way. You may know its faults, resent its stiffness, trust its sturdiness, and notice immediately when someone has left it out of order. Such knowledge is not affection exactly, but it has a tenderness made from use. Many workers have had this relationship with tools, a companionship built from irritation, reliance, and the daily relief when the tool does what it should. The Basel Ribbon Warper, considered from far away, becomes a symbol of forgotten labor, but considered from within the room, it is more simply a means of getting on with the day. This difference matters because the people who used such machines did not live as symbols. They had sore feet, favorite cups, worries about pay, private jokes, practiced hands, and opinions about which thread was troublesome. To remember them gently, we should let them remain ordinary. A thread breaks near the rear of the creel, and the sound is so small that a stranger would miss it. You hear it because the even run changes, and your eyes go to the slack line almost before the break has fully declared itself. The machine is stopped, the end is found, and the repair begins with no outward drama. This is the kind of interruption that fills working days everywhere, small enough to forget, necessary enough to shape the rhythm of the whole morning. The broken end is brought back, joined carefully, and guided again into its place among the others. For a little while after the repair, you watch that path more closely, as one might watch a child who has stumbled and risen. The thread behaves, the beam turns, and the tiny disturbance is absorbed into the longer calm. Work has a way of smoothing over its own small incidents when care is given quickly enough. The lostness of the ribbon warper is also tied to the loss of vocabulary. Words that were once plain in a trade can become strange within a generation, and then opaque a generation later. Warping, leasing, beaming, creeling, drawing in, selvage, reed, end, pick and shuttle may survive in technical books, but they lose the warmth of daily speech when fewer people use them at work. A word without a room around it becomes colder. In the 1920s room, though, the words are alive. Someone asks for more bobbins, someone mentions the beam, someone warns of a crossed end, and no one pauses to define anything because the work itself defines the language. The vocabulary is local, practical, and sometimes slightly different from workshop to workshop, with dialect and habit shaping terms as much as printed manuals do. Later histories may struggle to match these words neatly, but the workers did not need neatness, they needed usefulness. A term like ribbon warper may therefore point in several directions, toward a person, a task, a machine, or a station in the production flow. That ambiguity is not a failure of the past, but a sign that the past was lived rather than catalogued. Working people often name things according to immediate need, not according to the future preferences of researchers. The same word can be flexible because the room itself supplies the missing context. When that room disappears, the flexibility becomes confusion. An archive entry may say warper, and the reader wonders whether it means the apparatus, the worker, or the process. A wage record may say ribbon worker, and the specific daily labor dissolves into the broader trade. A photograph may show equipment with no caption, and without thread in motion, the purpose becomes a puzzle. The loss is gradual, built from many small omissions rather than a single silence. Yet the work can be approached again through patience. To understand the warper, you do not begin with the dramatic question of why it vanished, but with the plain question of what it did before vanishing. It gathered separate threads, preserved their order, set their tension, measured their length, and wound them onto a beam for weaving. In that sequence, the machine and worker become clear enough to stand together again in the mind. The noon hour arrives with its small relief, and the machine is left in a controlled pause rather than an abandoned state. Threads are secured if needed, moving parts are stilled, and the worker steps away with the faint feeling of the task continuing inside the muscles. Lunch may be bread, cheese, fruit, soup carried in a container, or whatever the household has managed that day. The food tastes of ordinary hunger, which is often the best seasoning in a working life. Conversation at noon may be light or practical, depending on the people and the pressure of the shop. Someone may speak of weather, rent, illness, a wedding, a church matter, a tram delay, or whether the new thread lot is worse than the last. Work talk and life talk blend naturally because work and life are not separate countries for people paid by the week. The machine waits through all of it, holding the morning's order in stillness. After the break, returning to the warper has a particular feeling, because the eyes must once again narrow from the whole world to the fine world of thread. The room may be brighter, warmer, and a little heavier, and the hands may need a few minutes to recover their exactness. You test the run gently, bringing the motion back as one might wake a sleeping animal without startling it. The thread accepts the afternoon with a slight gleam. There is a temptation, late in the day, to let familiarity do more work than attention, and the skilled worker knows this temptation well. Routine can soothe, but it can also dull. and the warper's discipline is to remain awake inside repetition without becoming tense. This is a difficult balance, almost moral in its quiet way, because care must continue after novelty is gone. The old trades were full of such balances, though they rarely called attention to themselves. The afternoon order may be for a ribbon no wider than 2 fingers, or perhaps wider, meant for a garment, a hat, a binding, or a decorative use that will be decided far from the workroom. The worker may not know the final purpose, and perhaps does not need to know it, though curiosity sometimes attaches itself to color. A bright shade may suggest celebration, a black ribbon mourning or formality, a striped arrangement school, uniform or fashion, but these thoughts pass lightly. The immediate fact is the warp's behavior. In a city like Basel, close to borders and trade routes, ribbons could belong to a wider world of movement. Goods passed through merchants, railways, postal routes, sample agents and shops, and the narrow bands made in local workshops might end up in wardrobes and stores far from the Rhine. But the warper's day remains rooted to one patch of floor, where the wider world narrows into thread paths. Trade expands outward, while labor gathers inward. This inward gathering is part of the sleepiness of the image, because the work does not rush towards spectacle. It returns again and again to the same careful center, where the question is whether the threads are right. Not whether the world is changing, not whether fashion will recover, not whether the machine will be remembered, but whether the next inch winds evenly. Such questions are small enough for peace and deep enough for dignity. The warper's hands may bear marks of work, though not necessarily dramatic ones. A small callus, a rough place near the thumb, a nick from scissors, dryness from washing, or a faint soreness from repeated motion may say more than any heroic scar. Quiet jobs leave quiet marks, and these marks are easily overlooked because they resemble ordinary life. The body becomes an archive that no institution can keep for long. As light begins to shift again, the threads take on a softer glow, and the workroom seems to exhale. The day's second beam, or the next portion of it, shows enough progress to satisfy the eye, and the remaining work can be planned without anxiety. If the order is urgent, the room may stay active longer, but urgency is not allowed to sharpen the handling of silk. Even under pressure, fine thread requires gentleness, and the material enforces its own slow law. This is one of the consolations of certain crafts, that the material refuses the worst impatience. Silk cannot be bullied into good order, any more than wet ink can be hurried into dryness without consequence. The worker may be tired, the overseer may be impatient, the customer may be waiting, but the thread still demands correct treatment. In this way, material reality protects a little pocket of slowness inside an industrial day. The world beyond the workroom may praise speed, output, delivery, and novelty, but the warper station keeps returning to the older virtue of readiness. Readiness is not flashy, and it is almost never celebrated when everything goes well. Yet a ready warp saves time later, protects costly silk, and allows the loom to become productive without repeated stoppage. The invisible economy of prevention runs through the whole job. At the end of the afternoon, you may record the completed length, or mark what remains, or simply report to the person who keeps track. The record is practical, not emotional, and it may reduce hours of attention to a line of writing. A date, a quantity, a color, a worker's name or number, and perhaps a customer code may be all that remains on paper. Behind that plain line stands the full day of watching. This is how many lives enter history sideways, not as stories, but as marks in ledgers, quantities in inventories, names in directories, and blurred figures at the edge of photographs. The ribbon warper is there, if one knows how to look, but rarely standing in the center with a clear caption. It must be found among neighboring words, in the shadow of looms, in the necessary preparation that every finished ribbon silently implies. And because it must be found that way, the search itself becomes slower, almost like the work. You follow one clue through trade records, another through machinery descriptions, another through surviving ribbons, another through the geography of Basel and its surrounding villages. Each clue is a thread, and only when they are held together does a shape begin to appear. To study a forgotten job is often to perform a kind of warping with memory. You gather the strands, preserve their order, and wind them carefully enough that they can be used by someone else. The comparison is gentle, but it holds. A historian, a curator, a descendant, or a listener in the dark may receive the prepared beam of memory and begin weaving an image from it. The workroom returns, not perfectly, but with enough order to be felt. Evening settles more fully now, and the machine is brought to rest with the same care it received at morning. The threads are secured, the tools are placed away, and the last small corrections are made so no one inherits confusion at dawn. The floor is swept, though a few bright fibers always seem to escape, catching under the frame or along the wall. A workshop is never completely free of what it makes. The warper stands still, but the day's motion remains in the air for a little while. You can almost hear the threads, though they no longer move, the way one hears the sea after leaving the shore, or the train after stepping onto a platform. This aftersound is part memory and part body, and it fades slowly as coats are gathered and lamps lowered. The room becomes ordinary again, but not empty. In the dimness, the prepared beam holds its wooed silk like a quiet promise carried forward. Tomorrow, or the next day, it may be taken to the loom, set in place, drawn through, and made part of a ribbon that will look simple when finished. No one who handles that ribbon later may imagine this hour, this room, or these threads resting in their first order. But the order is there, hidden inside the shine, and for tonight, that is enough. The loom room, when the prepared beam arrives, has a different temperament from the warping corner, though it is made from the same patience. Here the future ribbon has begun to feel more public, because pattern and surface will soon appear, and the hidden order of the warp will become visible in another form. The weaver or loom tender receives the beam with a practical look, checking not for beauty yet, but for the signs of good preparation. If the threads lie evenly, if the lease has kept its memory, if the beam has been wound without hard ridges or soft hollows, the work can continue with trust. You might carry the beam only a little distance, or someone else may take it from your station, depending on the shop's arrangement and the weight of the piece. Even this movement is careful, because a prepared warp is no longer loose thread, yet it is still vulnerable in the ways all half-finished things are vulnerable. It has been gathered, but not yet woven, ordered, but not yet secured by crossing weft. A careless bump or a confused handling can disturb what took hours to make calm. In the loom, the warp must be mounted, drawn through, and connected to a patterning system, if the ribbon requires more than plain structure. This is where many histories of ribbon making become more confident, because the loom has visible complexity, and the pattern seems to bloom from it. Cards, heddles, shuttles, reeds, and narrow beams provide a livelier story for photographs and demonstrations. The warper's earlier work withdraws like a tide beneath the surface. But if you watch closely, the warp is still present in everything the loom does. It is the lengthwise field through which the shuttle passes, the disciplined set of fine lines that gives the ribbon its edge, strength, and continuity. Each opening of the shed, each crossing of weft, and each small advancement of cloth depends on the warp remaining steady under tension. The loom may be the visible performer, but the warper has tuned the quiet instrument on which it plays. In a Basel ribbon shop of the 1920s, a loom might produce several narrow ribbons side by side, depending on its design, and the preparation for such work could be demanding in its own right. The more ribbons are woven at once, the more the arrangement of warps, colors, and tensions has to be understood before the loom begins. A mistake multiplied across several bands becomes wasteful very quickly, and silk is too costly to waste casually, so the warper's steadiness remains a form of economy as well as craft. Economic language can sound cold when applied to such delicate work, but workshops lived by it, and workers understood material value in the most direct way. A broken thread is not only an inconvenience, it is time, silk, patience, wages, and perhaps a delivery promise made less secure. Good preparation saves all of these without announcing that it has saved them. It makes the day smoother, and smoothness is one of the least celebrated forms of wealth. The ribbon trade had always depended on a balance between beauty and calculation. Merchants wanted colors that pleased buyers, patterns that followed fashion, and lengths that could be priced, shipped, and sold without trouble. Workers wanted thread that behaved, machines that could be trusted, and enough pay to justify the hours spent among fine lines and close attention. The warper stood where these wants met, in a narrow, practical channel, converting an order into an arranged length of possibility. If a ribbon was intended for a hat, the customer might think first of color, sheen, and how it sat against felt or straw. If it was meant for clothing, the buyer might notice how it folded, how the edge held, and whether it caught the light. If it was meant for binding, trimming, or packaging, its strength and neatness might matter more than decoration. None of these later uses would reveal the morning at the warper, yet each depended on the morning being done correctly. This is why forgotten preparatory trades are so interesting when approached gently. They remind us that many visible things begin in hidden arrangements, and that the visible world rests on careful beginnings we seldom pause to imagine. A ribbon can seem small enough to be dismissed, but it contains agriculture, trade, chemistry, design, machinery, labor, fashion, and domestic habit in one narrow strip. The warper did not hold all of that consciously at every moment, but the work passed through the hands all the same. When the loom begins, the ribbon appears slowly, and perhaps the warper sees it later, perhaps not. In some rooms, workers might pass near enough to glimpse the result of their preparation as it comes forward, a growing band of color and texture at the cloth beam. In others, tasks are separated enough that the prepared warp leaves one worker's world and enters another's. Both arrangements create a kind of distance, and that distance can deepen the later forgetting. A person who made one beginning may not be named in the story of the finished thing. The designer may be praised for the pattern, the merchant for the range, the factory for the product, and the loom for the mechanism. The warper, along with winders, draws-in, finishers, packers, and many others, remains in the soft, crowded background of production. Industrial history is full of such backgrounds, densely inhabited and dimly lit. Yet there is nothing dim about the work while it is being done. The threads are bright enough to trouble the eyes, the bobbins are real in the hand, the machine has weight, and the rhythm of the day is as solid as bread. Forgetting belongs to later observers, not to the lived experience. In the moment, the warper station is not obscure at all. It is simply where the next necessary thing is happening. A young worker learning the task might begin by watching rather than doing, because the machine's simplicity can deceive the inexperienced. The older worker may ask them to notice how the thread leaves the bobbin, how it enters the guide, how it lies among its neighbors, and how tension changes when the beam grows. At first, these details may seem like too many small things, each one almost the same as the next. Over time, the sameness opens and differences become visible. The apprentice learns that a good eye is not born all at once. It grows through mistakes, corrections, and the gradual training of attention until the unusual thread seems to lift itself from the ordinary field. A slack end has a different curve. A crossed path has a different shadow. A rough bobbin makes a sound that does not belong. Skill is often the ability to notice what should not be there while the whole room continues moving. This kind of skill rarely leaves behind written masterpieces. It leaves better beams, fewer stoppages, cleaner ribbons, and perhaps a reputation among co-workers that someone's work can be trusted. In families and workshops, such reputations matter deeply, though they may never travel far outside the trade. A person known for careful warping may have carried pride quietly, not as vanity, but as the settled knowledge of doing something well. The old workrooms also had hierarchies, pressures, and inequalities that should not be softened into a sentimental mist. Wages could be low, hours could be long, and the decline of the trade could make steady employment uncertain for people who had learned specialized tasks. Women's labor, especially in preparatory textile work, was often undernamed and undervalued, even when it required skill and concentration. Warmth toward the work need not hide the plain fact that skill and recognition were not always paid in equal measure. Still, a sleepful telling can hold both truths without making either sharp. The work could be tiring and underpaid, and also meaningful in its routine. It could be economically fragile, and also full of sensory knowledge. A worker could want better pay while still taking care with a thread, because dignity often survives inside conditions that do not fully honor it. The ribbon warper's forgotten place is not made more gentle by pretending the world was fair, but by seeing the person clearly within it. The 1920s carried particular uncertainty for trades tied to fashion and export. After the upheavals of the previous decade, markets did not simply return to old habits, and luxury goods faced changing tastes, disrupted customers, and competition from other regions and materials. In Basel and its surroundings, some workshops continued, some adapted, and some slowly lost the conditions that had supported them. The warper's station remained useful, but usefulness alone does not guarantee permanence. New machinery can also erase old names without fully erasing old tasks. As processes are combined, powered, standardized, or shifted into larger factories, a job once known by a specific role may become part of another operator's duties. A worker who once warped by one method may later tend a different machine that performs several preparatory steps together. The task continues in altered form, while the old name thins and then vanishes from daily speech. This is not always loss in the simple sense, because workers often welcomed machines or arrangements that reduced strain, improved wages, or gave steadier employment. But from the viewpoint of memory, combination can make distinct skills harder to see. When several tasks become one job title, the earlier distinctions become faint, even though each distinction once mattered in practice. The ribbon warper was vulnerable to exactly this kind of absorption. A museum visitor looking at an old ribbon might ask about design, fiber, date, and place, but not always about warping. A visitor looking at a loom might ask how the pattern was made, and the answer may turn toward cards, mechanisms, and the pleasing logic of repeated motion. The preparatory beam may be mentioned only briefly, as though it arrives from nowhere already arranged. In this way, the warper can be lost even while standing very near the story being told. To bring it back, one has to linger before the loom. One has to stand in the quieter room and ask how the threads reached order, how their length was measured, how their colors were arranged, and who watched them before anyone watched the ribbon. This slower questioning changes the finished object. A strip of silk becomes less like an isolated pretty thing and more like the last visible page of a longer book. The book begins again at the creel, where the bobbins sit in rows like small stored hours. Each bobbin has its own history, its own winding, its own chance of flaw or smoothness, and its own relation to the thread beside it. The worker moves among them with the practiced economy of someone who knows there is no need to dramatize care. Care is simply the way the work gets done. A bobbin that feeds badly may be set aside, inspected, rewound, or used in a place where its weakness can be managed. Decisions like this are ordinary, but they reveal the worker's judgment, because not every problem requires rejection and not every flaw can be forgiven. Materials are expensive, time is limited, and perfection is balanced against usefulness with every small choice. The warper's intelligence is therefore both tactile and practical. The measuring of length is another quiet part of the work. A warp must be long enough for the order, perhaps allowing for waste, tying, loom setup, and the small losses that attend any textile process. Measurement may involve a counter, a circumference, marks, or established workshop procedures depending on the machine and period. However it is done, the point is not abstract exactness for its own sake, but a length that will serve the weaving without leaving too much costly remainder. The worker who measures wrongly may burden everyone later, either by running short or by tying up materials longer than needed. Such mistakes are rarely spectacular, but they are remembered inside workshops because they create avoidable work. Good measurement is another form of kindness to the future, a phrase no one needs to say aloud for it to be true. A beam wound to the right length carries a kind of practical peace. You can imagine a ledger nearby, perhaps not at the warper's station but in the office, or at a desk, where the completed orders are entered. The ledger may seem dry, but it mirrors the workroom in its own narrow way, turning color, length, and labor into lines of ink. Someone must keep track of silk issued, work completed, stock remaining, and deliveries promised. The office and the warping room are connected by these details, though the smells and sounds of each are very different. The office smells of paper, dust, ink, perhaps tobacco, and polished wood, while the warping room smells of fiber, oil, and warmed machinery. One room handles the trade as numbers and correspondence, while the other handles it as thread under tension. Both are necessary, yet the office often leaves better records because writing is its nature. The warping room leaves fewer documents because its records are wound onto beams and then woven away. This imbalance shapes what later generations can know. Paper survives in boxes, ribbons survive in collections. Machines survive if someone has space. Habits survive only in people, and people cannot be shelved. When the last workers who learned a certain machine are gone, the habit becomes inference. We can still approach it, but we approach with lowered voices, aware that some exact gestures have become unrecoverable. There is a tenderness in admitting this. Not every lost detail can be restored, and not every hand movement can be named with confidence after a century of change. But the broad shape of the work can be honored without pretending to know every particular. We can say that the warper prepared the lengthwise threads for ribbon weaving, and we can say that this required order, tension, measurement, and care. Around those facts, the room can grow softly. The afternoon heat, when it comes, may make the work slower in a different way. Windows may be opened only carefully because too much moving air troubles thread, but stale air tires workers and makes concentration heavier. A cloth might be dampened for cleaning hands, or a shade adjusted to keep direct sun from bright silk. The workroom is always negotiating with the day, making small accommodations that no production chart records. If rain comes, the light changes and the city seems to draw inward. Drops may touch the window and the sound outside becomes softer, more continuous, while inside the thread keeps its finer whisper. Damp weather can make some materials more tractable, though it can also bring its own inconveniences, especially in rooms not perfectly controlled. The worker responds not with theory, but with small adjustments learned over time. In winter, breath may be visible at the start of the day in some older rooms, especially before heating has fully reached the corners. Fingers may be warmed around a cup, rubbed together, or held near a stove before the first delicate threading. Silk in cold light can look especially clear, with colors seeming a little more distant and hard. The worker knows that beauty may be present even when comfort is not. In summer, the room may smell more strongly of oil and warm wood, and the body may tire faster from standing near machinery. Sleeves are lighter, windows are watched, water is welcome, and the day's pace may feel heavier even when the work itself has not changed. The thread may cling, workers may grow quieter, and the beam may seem to fill more slowly than it did in cool weather. Still, the order advances by inches, and inches are enough. The warper's routine contains many beginnings and endings inside one day. A bobbin begins and ends, a section begins and ends, a beam begins and ends. An order begins and ends, and through all of them the worker repeats the same attentive motions. This nested rhythm is one reason the image is restful, because it gives time a soft structure without urgency. There is always a next thread, but rarely a need to leap. When a beam is complete, it does not announce itself grandly. The worker knows because the measure has been reached, the order has been fulfilled, and the last threads have come forward into their appointed place. The machine is stopped, the ends are secured, and the beam is prepared for its next journey. The satisfaction is quiet enough to be missed by anyone not doing the work. Perhaps the worker steps back and sees the beam fully for the first time as an object. What had been a process now has weight and shape. A wound cylinder of silk whose surface carries the day's discipline. It may not be beautiful in the way the finished ribbon will be beautiful, but it has the beauty of readiness. A loaf before baking, a page before printing, a field before sowing, a beam before weaving. Each has its own calm, and in that calm the lost warper becomes easier to understand. It was not lost because it lacked grace, and not because it lacked importance, but because its grace was preparatory, and its importance was absorbed into the success of other things. It made no final product for a shop window, no broadcloth for a buyer's hand, no patent display that could stand alone. It made the conditions under which those things could exist. The idea is simple, but simple ideas often become deeper when held patiently. Many people spend their lives making conditions rather than conclusions, preparing rooms, arranging materials, checking systems, tending thresholds, and leaving behind little that can be separated from the work it enabled. Their success becomes someone else's smooth path. The ribbon warper is one of their quiet ancestors. In Basel, where the old ribbon trade once linked households, workshops, merchants, and machines, the warper's disappearance is also the disappearance of a particular arrangement of society. Not only a tool was lost, but a way of organizing time, skill, family, capital, and place around narrow silk goods. The decline of such work changed rooms, streets, habits, and futures, even when no single day felt like an ending. Whole worlds often leave by reducing the number of mornings in which they are needed. The workroom still holds, in imagination, one of those mornings before the leaving was complete. The creel is filled, the beam is set, the worker is present, and the city outside has not yet turned the machine into a relic. Nothing needs to be explained to the people in the room, because the work's meaning is active around them. Explanation belongs to us, arriving later, carrying our questions like lanterns. You do not ask the worker to become a symbol, and you do not ask the machine to answer every question about industry, memory, or decline. You only stand beside the warper long enough to see the thread move, and that is already a kind of return. The machine turns, the beam gathers, the hand corrects, and the narrow future of a ribbon is prepared. In this smallness, there is room for a whole world to rest. As the final light fades again, the workroom's colors withdraw into brown, gray, black, and the muted shine of silk. A lamp may remain over the station, making a small island around the warper, while the rest of the room quiets. The tools are returned, the bobbins are checked, and the order slip is placed where morning will find it. Each closing gesture is a promise to the next beginning. Outside, the street has taken on the softer sounds of evening, with footsteps, distant wheels, voices behind windows, and the low river moving beyond its banks. Inside, the warper stands still, full of the day's absent motion. The prepared beam waits, and the loose ends are held in order, and the guides reflect a last thin line of light. Nothing is forgotten here yet, because the room still knows what every part is for. For now, that knowing is enough. The machine rests without needing a name larger than the one the workers give it, and the work rests inside the hands that will return. The silk lies quiet, wound in its careful layers, ready for the loom, ready for the ribbon, ready to disappear into usefulness. And the old Basel evening settles around it, patient, ordinary, and kind. Morning returns, not as a new beginning exactly, but as the same room slowly becoming visible again under a paler portion of sky. The warper's frame appears first in outline, then in edges, then in the small details that the worker knows before the lamp is lit. A thin coolness rests on the beam, and the tied threads wait with the stillness of things that have been properly left. You enter quietly, because even familiar work seems to prefer a gentle arrival. There is a moment before the hands begin when the whole trade feels suspended in that narrow space between yesterday's care and today's continuation. The order is not yet ribbon, the thread is not yet cloth, and the machine is not yet motion, but every part is already leaning towards its next use. You check the note, the bobbins, the guiding path, the layer of the threads, and the small places where yesterday's dust might have gathered. This is not doubt, only respect for materials that can be changed by what seems almost nothing. The old warping room has its own way of teaching patience through objects that refuse to be rushed. A scissors with dark handles, a blunt pencil, a folded slip, a wooden rod rubbed smooth, and a beam with its growing weight all speak the same plain language of readiness. Nothing there is decorative in the easy sense, yet everything has the beauty of having a purpose close at hand. In workshops, beauty often comes from the absence of anything unnecessary. The thread begins to move again, first with a careful testing, then with a steadier run that settles into the room like a remembered tune. The silk makes its faint sound through the guides, and the beam accepts another layer with the quiet confidence of something built for repetition. Your attention spreads across the machine without strain, touching each possible trouble place for a moment, and then moving on. It is a kind of watching that feels wide and narrow at once. In this continued motion, the question of why we lost track of the warper becomes less like an accusation and more like a weathered fact. The work never tried to stand apart from the process, and so later memory did not easily separate it from everything around it. It belonged to the order of preparation, and preparation tends to dissolve into the object prepared, just as the morning dissolves into the day. The warper's trace remains, but it is hidden inside usefulness. A finished ribbon does not carry a label saying that its warp was wound evenly on a grey morning by a patient worker near Basel. It carries colour, sheen, texture, width, and perhaps the slight firmness of a well-made edge, all of which seem to belong to the ribbon itself. The human care becomes material character, and the machine's guidance becomes a quality no buyer needs to name. That is one of the quietest ways labor disappears, by becoming indistinguishable from success. You may think of the ribbons themselves, not as grand luxuries, but as narrow companions to ordinary lives. They trimmed garments, tied packages, edged linens, marked uniforms, finished hats, and brightened small domestic arrangements that would otherwise have been plainer. Some were expensive, some modest, some ceremonial, some entirely practical, and many passed through hands that never paused over their making. A ribbon could be handled daily and still conceal the long chain that produced it. In the 1920s, some ribbons may have already looked old-fashioned to younger eyes, tied to styles that were loosening their hold. Wide hat trimmings, elaborate dress decorations, and certain ornamental habits were changing as silhouettes grew simpler and social life found new forms. Yet ribbon did not vanish all at once, because useful and decorative materials rarely leave the world in a single gesture. They recede by category, by customer, by fashion, by price, and by the slow reorganization of taste. The worker at the warper would feel such change through work offered and work withheld. Perhaps the order book carried fewer elaborate figured designs, or more plain narrow lengths, or colors chosen for restraint rather than display. Perhaps a familiar customer stopped ordering while another requested cheaper goods or shorter runs. These changes might be discussed in the shop with practical concern, then set aside because the thread in front of you still needs guiding. Every craft has this double life, one part bound to large movements and one part bound to the next small task. A historian may see industries declining, markets shifting, and technologies changing, while the worker sees a bobbin that will not feed, a beam nearly complete, and a lamp that needs adjusting. Both views are true, but they operate at different distances. The sleepy truth of the warper lives in the near distance, where the thread is real enough to fill the mind. The machine's form encourages this nearness. You stand close enough to see the fine shadows between ends, close enough to hear a bobbin's unevenness, and close enough to feel when tension changes through the faint behavior of the moving line. Unlike great machines that keep people at a distance, the warper asks the worker to remain near, observant, and almost conversational with the material. Its industrial nature is intimate rather than monumental. This intimacy makes it easy to forget, because intimate tools often leave fewer public stories. The machines that impress visitors are the large ones, the ones that shake floors, move with iron confidence, or produce a finished object in a visible way. A warper does not perform for visitors, and perhaps would look nearly motionless to someone who didn't understand the significance of the thread moving through it. It does its best work at the scale of the hand and eye. Still, for the worker, the machine's slow performance is full of information. The beam's surface tells whether the threads are laying properly, the guide rods reveal whether paths remain clean, and the creel shows whether the supply is balanced. Even the waste thread on the floor says something, because too much waste may mean a poor batch, rough handling, or a day made difficult by weather or haste. Nothing in the room is entirely silent to someone trained by repetition. The creel, especially, has a quiet presence. It stands behind the work like a patient wall of small stored lengths, each bobbin waiting to release its thread into the shared movement. Rows of bobbins can look almost domestic, like jars on a pantry shelf, until they begin feeding and become part of an ordered industrial act. The comparison is not fanciful. Workshops and kitchens have always shared a knowledge of sequence, preparation, storage, and timing. A worker may move from bobbin to bobbin with a basket or tray, replacing what is emptied, checking what will soon be needed, and keeping the arrangement faithful to the order. The task looks simple when the hands know it, but simplicity is often only skill made quiet. The wrong bobbin in the wrong place can disturb color order, tension, or supply, and so each small placement matters. The day is built from small placements. When the thread is dyed, color adds another layer of attentiveness, because the eye must distinguish not only presence and absence, but sequence and shade. Two dark colors may look similar in dull light, yet behave differently in the pattern or border of the ribbon. A worker learns to bring them closer to the window, tilt them slightly, or compare them against a known sample before trusting the arrangement. Color, like tension, has to be kept in order. The dyes used in the region have their own broader story, connected to chemical knowledge and industrial development. But at the warper, they arrive simply as colored silk. A shade may be admired for a second, but its beauty does not excuse disorder. Red must feed where red belongs, blue where blue belongs, black where black belongs, and a pale line must not wander into a place assigned to another. The discipline of color is another form of counting, though the count is done partly by the eye. A particular ribbon might require only two colors, perhaps a dark center with a lighter edge, or a pale ground with a narrow border. Another may need several repeated stripes, each one narrow enough that the mistake of a single end could become visible later. The warper holds the planned arrangement in the body, moving from creel to guide to beam with a careful loyalty to the future design. Pattern begins before pattern can be seen. This is one reason the preparatory worker deserves more attention than the surviving object usually grants. A design does not leap directly from paper to loom. It must pass through arrangements of thread, mechanical setup, and human checking. The warper's contribution may not be creative in the dramatic sense, but it is creative in the older sense of bringing something into condition. It makes the possible workable. The work also has its own ethics of exactness. Not every error is equally serious, and the worker must decide when to stop, when to repair, and when to continue without fuss. Excessive anxiety would slow everything and make the day brittle, while carelessness would allow small faults to grow. Skill lies in the middle, in the calm judgment that neither panics nor neglects. A younger worker may learn this middle slowly. At first, every irregularity may seem alarming, and the machine may appear full of traps waiting to embarrass inexperienced hands. Later, the worker learns that some tremors are harmless, some knots are acceptable, some shadows are only shadows, and some faint changes deserve immediate attention. The job becomes less frightening not because it becomes less detailed, but because the details acquire meaning. Meaning, in a workroom, often begins as difference. This thread is too tight, that one too slack, this bobbin poorly wound, that edge clean, this sound ordinary, that sound wrong. With enough days, the worker carries a map of differences that no one outside the trade can easily see. The map is not drawn anywhere, but it guides every motion. When such workers disappear from a trade, their maps disappear with them, unless someone has taken unusual care to record them. Manuals may preserve procedures, and machines may preserve shapes, but the living map of difference is harder to save. A retired worker can explain some of it, perhaps with gestures and stories, but even then, the explanation depends on the listener's patience and the presence of material to touch. Without thread moving, some knowledge stays asleep. The loss of the Basel Ribbon Warper is therefore not only the loss of an object or job title, but the loss of a way of noticing. It is the loss of eyes trained to see silk in motion, fingers trained to feel tension, and ears trained to hear small faults before they become larger ones. These forms of noticing were once common enough not to be remarkable. Later, when they became rare, people had already stopped asking exactly what they were. A quiet sadness can rest there without becoming heavy. We cannot save every vanished skill entire, and no archive can hold the full warmth of a working morning. But we can slow our attention and let the outlines return, respecting the fact that ordinary labor contains knowledge as real as any invention. The warper's work, though modest, asks for that respect. By mid-morning, the beam has grown enough that its surface must be watched more carefully. A full beam changes the angle and feel of the winding, and the worker adjusts without turning the adjustment into a separate event. The silk must continue lying evenly, not burrowing, not ridging, not pulling more on one side than another. The beam's roundness becomes a record of the day's steadiness. There is a quiet pleasure in seeing the surface build correctly. Each layer disappears beneath the next. But none is truly lost, because a poor earlier layer would announce itself through trouble above. The work resembles memory in that way, with hidden layers shaping the visible present. A beam that looks smooth is not merely smooth at the surface. It has been made smooth through what came before. The machine may include a measuring dial or counter, or it may depend on older methods suited to the workshop's habit. Whatever the system, the worker does not trust it blindly in every circumstance, because instruments help but do not replace attention. A counter can mislead if the thread slips, a mark can be misread in poor light, and a mechanical aid can drift if it is worn. Good workers respect tools without surrendering judgment to them entirely. This balance between mechanism and judgment belongs to many older industrial processes. Machines extended the worker's capacity, standardized certain motions, and allowed work at scales the hand alone could not manage. Yet they often relied on human senses to maintain quality, especially when materials were delicate or varied. The warper is a small example of this larger truth, a machine that organizes threads while still depending on someone who understands their behavior. In a more modern telling, we might want a clean line between handcraft and machine industry, but the warping room refuses that division. The worker is not simply hand-baking ribbon, and the machine is not simply replacing the worker. They form a working pair, each correcting the limits of the other, each useless for the order without the other's contribution. The silk passes through this partnership without needing the theory named. The room's sounds gather again as others begin their own tasks. Footsteps, low talk, a chair moved, paper folded, a door closed, and the continuing thread sound blend into a texture as fine as the material itself. None of these sounds dominates, and the room never becomes silent, yet the overall effect can still be restful in memory. Repetitive work creates its own hush, even when it is not quiet in the literal sense. You may notice the smell of paste or sizing from another part of the shop, mingled with oil and the faint dryness of stored silk. Textile rooms have layered scents, because fiber, wood, metal, human presence, and cleaning all contribute something small. The smell is not perfume, but after years it becomes one of the strongest doors into memory. A person who once worked there might encounter a similar smell decades later and feel the old room return without warning. This returning can be gentle. The past does not always arrive as a sharp ache. Sometimes it arrives as the remembered temperature of a handle, the sheen of a thread, or the way afternoon light fell across a beam. For someone who spent years at such a machine, the warper might have become part of the inner furniture of life. Even if the name faded from public memory, it may have remained in private sensation for a long while. The difficulty is that private sensation rarely becomes documented history. A ledger records wages, not the chill of the guide rod. An inventory records equipment, not the worker's preferred way of tying a small knot. A city directory records an occupation, not the sound of the room before noon. To approach the warper fully, one has to read between records and honor the kinds of evidence that are felt rather than filed. This does not mean inventing without care. It means allowing known processes, material facts, and historical setting to guide imagination gently, without pretending every detail is proven. The warper's work is reconstructible in its essentials because textiles require certain preparations and ribbon weaving requires ordered warp. Around that essential truth, the ordinary life of the workroom can be evoked with humility. A small clock may strike or tick somewhere above the noise, and the day moves forward without hurry. You pause to drink, perhaps from a cup kept on a shelf away from the thread, and the taste of warm coffee or water returns the body to itself. Then the hands return to the machine because the thread does not move itself into order. The day is made of these returns. The body's relation to the machine is measured not only by standing, but by reach. How far to the bobbin, how far to the guide, how far to the beam, how much bend at the waist, how much lift at the shoulder, how long the eyes must remain close. Over years, such measurements become embodied, and the worker no longer thinks of distances as distances. They become the shape of work. If a different person uses the machine, the room notices in small ways. A taller worker reaches differently. A left-handed worker may arrange a tool another way. A beginner leaves tension less even, and an older worker may slow the pace but reduce mistakes. Machines are sometimes described as if they impose identical labor on everyone, yet people quietly adapt them whenever they can. Even standard work has human variation folded inside it. The Basel Ribbon Warper, therefore, was never only one thing. It was a type of machine, a place in production, a set of gestures, a body's learned relation to thread, and an occupation that may have been named differently according to who was writing. When a thing has many forms of existence, it can be strong while alive and fragile after death. It survives in use better than in description. By noon, the light has turned broader, filling the room more evenly and making the fine lines easier to follow. The worker's shoulders have settled into their familiar position, and the morning's stiffness has mostly left the hands. The beam is not finished, but it has crossed the invisible point where the day's work feels substantial. You can look at it and see that the hours have taken form. There is comfort in work that makes time visible. Many tasks pass without leaving anything the eye can measure, but warping leaves its accumulation plainly on the beam. The worker can see the day growing, can see patience becoming material, and can see the order moving from possibility toward readiness. This visible accumulation may not remove fatigue, but it gives fatigue a companion. During a short pause, a worker might tidy the shelf, sharpen a pencil, trim a rough knot, or move a pile of empty bobbins. These small acts keep the station from sliding into disorder, and they give the mind a softer task before close attention resumes. Tidying is sometimes mistaken for idleness by those who do not understand process. But in a thread room, disorder has consequences. A clear surface is a quiet form of preparation. Outside, the city continues, and perhaps a bell marks the hour with a sound older than the machines. Basel's streets carry students, clerks, shopkeepers, travelers, children and workers from other trades, all moving through their own forms of routine. The warping room is only one small chamber in the city's larger body, but for the person inside it, that chamber is the present world. Every life has such rooms, literal or not, where the wider world narrows into what must be done next. The afternoon may bring a supervisor with another order, or a question about when the beam will be ready. The answer is measured, neither defensive nor dramatic, because everyone who knows the work understands that completion depends on correct movement, not wishful haste. If more speed is requested, perhaps the pace increases slightly, but only within the limits silk permits. Fine work has a way of humbling impatience. The order sheet may include an unfamiliar customer or an old one. Old customers carry a kind of inherited expectation, because the workshop knows what they usually accept, what they complain about, and which details matter most to them. New customers require a little more caution, because their preferences have not yet become routine. Even at the warper, far from the buyer's hand, such knowledge may shape the atmosphere around an order. A ribbon destined for an export market might carry colors or widths chosen for tastes far away, and the worker may hear place names without ever seeing those places. The world reaches the warping room through labels, instructions, and material requirements, not through travel. There is something quietly vast about this, that a stationary worker might handle thread meant for unknown streets, unknown shops, unknown hands. The beam is local in making and distant in purpose. This distance makes the warper's disappearance feel even more natural, because the finished ribbon may leave the region while the preparatory labor remains unmarked. Once the ribbon travels, it belongs to the buyer's story, the merchant's stock, the garment's life, or the household's drawer. The worker's room does not travel with it. Only the order built into the thread travels silently. And yet, when an old ribbon survives, perhaps folded in a box or fastened in a sample book, the warper's work survives inside it. The threads still run lengthwise in their disciplined order, still hold the width, still form the field through which the weft was passed. The human and mechanical preparation remains materially present, even if unnamed. To look closely at the ribbon is to stand, faintly, before the warper again. Late in the day, the light narrows, and the worker's attention narrows with it. The remaining length is checked, the bobbins are watched, and the beam's surface is inspected with the calm caution that comes near completion. A small mistake at the end may not ruin everything, but it can still complicate what should be simple. Care does not fade simply because the finish is mere. The final sections pass through with a soft insistence. The thread seems both endless and nearly done. One of the little contradictions familiar in repetitive work. When there is much to do, the task feels like a landscape. When there is little left, every inch seems to ask for notice. The worker grants that notice because ending well is part of having worked well. Once the measure is reached, the machine slows, then stops, and the room's sound changes around the absence. The threads are no longer moving, and for a moment the ear continues expecting them, filling in the missing whisper. You secure the ends, check the order, mark the beam, and let the body recognize that this particular length has been brought to rest. A completed warp has a stillness different from an unfinished one. The beam may now wait for transport to the loom, or it may be placed in a rack with others, depending on the flow of work. It carries no ornament, no finished edge, and no obvious beauty for someone who does not know what it means. But to the worker, it has the dignity of a task completed correctly. It is ready, and readiness is enough. The station must be cleared for whatever comes next because textile work rarely leaves a space empty for long. Empty bobbins are gathered, full ones counted, waste removed, tools returned, and the next order considered. The day may be close to ending, but the trade thinks ahead through lists and shelves and prepared materials. Tomorrow's work begins in today's last arrangement. As the room quiets, the warper stands between completed and unbegun work, a modest machine holding both memory and expectation. Its frame has seen enough mornings that any single morning seems ordinary, yet each one adds its own slight wear, polish, and adjustment. This is how machines age in service, not only through damage, but through being included in human routine. They become old by helping. A machine retired from such service can appear strangely mute. Without thread, without workers, without order slips and small tools nearby, it may seem like an incomplete explanation. Visitors may walk past it unless someone tells them where to place their attention. The loss of the warper is partly the loss of that someone. So, we supply the attention gently, not with excitement, but with patience, equal to the object. We remember the creel filled before dawn, the cold rod under the fingers, the bobbin that complained, the careful knot, the slowly filling beam, and the order slips softened by handling. We remember not one spectacular day, but many unrecorded days layered like thread. In that layering, the forgotten machine becomes quietly visible again. Night comes to the workshop without needing to be announced. The lamps are lowered or turned out, the windows darken, and the tools settle into the positions where morning will find them. The prepared beam rests somewhere nearby, holding its length of ordered silk, while the warper itself waits empty or half-dressed for another beginning. Nothing in the room asks to be admired. It only asks not to be entirely lost.